Hello, I'm Chris Flischer, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore concepts that allow us to broaden our view of the world. You'll hear interesting topics, meet fascinating guests, and discover who you really are. Using the time-tested practices of astrology, you'll learn how to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Astrology, art, and spiritual adventure on Turning of the Wheel TV with Chris Flischer. Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flischer. As you know, this is a show typically about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. And today we're going to take a bit of an adventure into the realm of probably a topic that will shock you in some regards, but not to be afraid because there's a positive ending to the story and I want you to understand and hang in there for it. We're going to be talking about the concept of death, and not in a negative way, but in a positive way, because death is a birth of sorts, and it's the next level that we will arrive, and it's also part of our necessary journey. And so my guest today is Raven Caldera. He's here to talk to me about this great topic. So we were talking before we got on the camera about the idea, and we thought, gee, it could be a little scary. People run from that word, and just that sake alone is reason to have the conversation. Why are people running from that word?
Well, it's loss. It's scary. It is scary.
Of course, it's very scary.
And it's hard, and it's painful. And not just physical death, which we will all go through, but the many little deaths that we suffer throughout our lives, the many little losses, and the loss of other people. And it's not that it isn't hard, but as with everything, there are two sides to it. There is the every time you go out into nature and you look at all the green in nature, what you have to tell yourself is, again and again, this much life could only have grown on this much death.
That's right.
So,
and you think just the simple fact that the fertilizer and what you know, the decomposition, whether it's leaves or cow manure or whatever, it's a form of deconstruction that is in itself a sort of a regeneration each time. And so the point I think we're trying to make, and we're going to be discussing as we go further, is that this is not something to fear, but rather to accept and embrace. And life is a dualistic dialogue. And in that dualistic dialogue, we have to have the pluses and the minuses, the positives and negatives, all are inherent in all that we deal with. And so in that, we from every, I mean, it may be a cliche, but when the door closes, another one opens. That is true. Out of every death comes a birth. We know that this is very much the case. And so when we see this manifest and come about in our lives, we shouldn't run from them. We should look at them perhaps more as lessons, you know, sort of touchstones, milestones that we have to cross as we go through life. Don't you think?
Yes, I'm a Northern tradition shaman, which means I do the shamanism of my Norse Germanic Eurasian ancestors, and I also work with other spiritual traditions, as they call me. And the two deities that are strongest in my life right now, all my life I've been dedicated to Hela, who's the Norse death goddess, and she is divided down the middle, half beautiful woman and half rotting corpse or skeleton, and I think that's a very wonderful way.
It's a metaphor.
It's a wonderful way of looking at death, in that it has its beautiful side and it has its, and they are both true. They are both equally valuable and equally sacred. And I also work with Shiva, and the aspect of Bhairava, who's god of the cremation grounds, and in sort of a non-Norse tradition. And so I do a lot of work with death. I'm a death shaman, and what that means is that I do funerals. I work with people who are having end-of-life issues. I work with survivors. Sort of
in the line of a hospice worker, sort of coming in at that.
Yeah, I'm not a medical person, but I do a lot of counseling, and people who are going through divorces, people who are having massive transitions in their life, where something is dying, possibly them, possibly their loved ones, possibly some piece of their life. That's my job, is to wade in there, is to bring them down to the underworld. And
show them that it's not as bad.
Yeah, and be the guide that helps them back out of it.
The guide is an important role, I think, because it allows you to help reframe the conversation. You know, in other words, set it in a different context where we are able to see that it can be a new beginning. And I often think that when it comes to death, we know, I think the reason we as individuals, living and breathing individuals, fear death so much is because we know how it feels when we lose someone. I don't think as if it's the person that goes who has a hard time. I think it's those who are left behind who have the hardest time, because we are the ones who miss those who've gone beyond. Those who've gone beyond are off on a brand new journey, and you know, who knows where they're going and what life holds for them and what it looks like. So I think that there's a redemptive quality to it.
Yes, there is. There's a piece of a poem by Erica Jong that I use as a prayer to my goddess, to the death goddess that I serve, and I love it, and it's hard to say sometimes, but it goes, "Goddess, teach me to praise loss, death, and the passing of all things, for from this flux I know your blessings flow."
Yeah, that's perfect. I mean, it's a beautiful sentiment, and you know, I think if we were to look at it in terms of a metaphor or even symbolically, we know that the seasons come and go, just as people come and go, just as the days come and go. This is all a part of the cyclical nature of the universe and the cosmos, and it's just part of the natural process that we have to endure. So, as we had mentioned when we spoke before, you know, we have to realize this, and by entering into it rather than running from it, we sort of become more familiar with it, and we can become cozy or even comfortable with the concept.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. I have actually had a near-death experience. I've had a full-out near-death experience. So I've been there. I've crossed that boundary. I've come back, and I'm not afraid of it.
I've heard that many times. Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, people always ask me, "What did you feel just before I passed out, knowing that I might not wake up again?" A huge sense of calm. There is this thing that happens that is like, okay, it's this massive calm. That, gee, I might not wake up. Okay.
Do you think it's resignation, or is it acceptance?
I think it may be chemical for all I know.
Yeah, it could very well be. That makes sense.
It is this complete radical acceptance of whatever is going to happen, and just being completely at peace with whatever happens next. Which it's kind of ironic that sometimes we have to get to the edge of death to feel that and really know what that feels like.
Did that experience change your view of life?
Oh, hugely.
Yeah, of course.
Besides the fact that it was shamanic rebirth and my goddess used it to tear me up and put me back together differently, I came back and there were so many things that I had been afraid of before, those fears were gone. It's like you don't sweat the small stuff. All these little things that would terrify me before, they were gone, because after this, they're nothing.
Right.
And so
it sort of gave you a sense of proportion.
Yes, and it
a
did
context,
change me.
a context for what that looks like and where we are and how do we mitigate that. And it sort of gives you a much better, broader view of, you know, the value, and I think an appreciation for life.
Yes.
And an appreciation for daily events and those that are around us certainly heightens that dramatically.
And I do live with a chronic genetic illness that will kill me unless I'm hit by a bus, and it could kill me soon or it could kill me later. And while I'm doing my best to stay alive, working very hard in it, there is that. You know, the death goddess stands behind me. She's over my shoulder here, and so I'm aware of that. And there's a certain amount of. So what does it mean to live as if you could die, even if you're perfectly healthy? And
well, it could happen at any time to any of us.
Yes, it could. You never know. Plane could crash. Something.
Right. Yes.
You know,
exactly.
we ride in cars. That's taking your life in your own hands. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't ride in cars. It means to think about, well, so what would that mean to live like that? To live like, would you tell people more? Would you remember more to tell them that you loved them? To tell them that you cared? To do things? To not worry about, oh, I'll put that off. Maybe not put things off. So
maybe not put things off and be mindful of where you are at the time. I think to be appreciative of being in the here and now is very much the case, because time is a continuum and it is a moving target. I mean, the Earth is moving at 18.75 miles per second, and in that time, the second that just passed is never going to be recurring. So you want to be mindful, and I think being fully present in that capacity allows you to fully embrace everything that's happening to your life. It makes you hyper aware, which is valuable thing to understand and to really embrace.
To bring astrology into it, because I know we like to do that.
We do.
There's Pluto and Saturn and Chiron and Neptune to a certain extent in the 8th house, and these are all things that the 8th house is the house of death, and that doesn't necessarily. Astrologers argue over whether they can look at an 8th house and see your death there. Jury's out on that.
I wouldn't go so far as to say that.
Yeah.
I don't think that that's a successful use of astrology per se. I would never do that because I think it sets in motion a unfulfilled or a fulfilled prophecy.
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
A self-fulfilling prophecy, which you don't want to lead someone down that road. I think it's important to say, you know, depending upon what your eighth house looks like, you may have character, you may have information there, you may have planets there that are significant. It just is simply an awareness, perhaps, as well.
Yeah. And they used to say that Saturn was one's death, but I don't think that's necessarily. I think Saturn's obstacles, and death can be something that if you don't honor it, if you don't work with those obstacles and compensate for them, maybe you'll die.
Well, Saturn represented time. You know, it was
yeah.
Chronos. It was the sort of the grim reaper. It's always been its symbolic.
Yes.
But I don't think of it that way. I think more perhaps. I think the eighth house is an important piece of what it is to be in that realm. But I don't know as though it is, it's not a foregone conclusion, because there's plenty of people who have died who have not had those aspects. So we can't throw that out there as a construct or as a known.
But certainly Saturn and Pluto also, the eighth house is Scorpio and Pluto associated. And Pluto is transformation, which is
rebirth, it's
burn it all
regeneration
down.
and coming up out of the ashes.
And they're not just about physical death, they're about all the little deaths that we have. And Chiron, I find, is often, Chiron, the planetoid / asteroid, when it goes, it's often about other people's deaths in your life.
Exactly, yes.
The first author to write a big book about Chiron did it because it went over her son and her father died, and it went over her moon and her mother died. So being the mourning survivor is often the Chiron issue.
Is that Barbara Hand Clow by any chance?
I don't recall.
Okay.
I think so.
Yeah.
But yes, that kind of thing. So that's sort of death from the other side, getting to be the survivor and saying that why am I still alive? Why? How they're gone? How can I live through this? And
yeah, I think it's a misappropriation of the of astrology as a tool to try to search that out. I know that Vedic astrologers are pretty precise with that. But I don't know if it serves any real function to do that. I think it sort of removes the specter of the ability to live in the now in some ways. Because if you're always worried about that, you're like, oh my gosh, I got so many days left or whatever, you're going to run to that deadline, and maybe a self-fulfilling prophecy, I should say.
They've done research, Dr. Bernie Siegel has done a lot of research on discovering that if you tell someone that you have 3 months, they will, if you're a doctor and a person in authority and you say you have 3 months to live, then they will
live to that.
They will obediently die on schedule.
Exactly.
And if they're stubborn people who say, no, I'm not gonna, often they tend to live longer. They tend to outlive their death date, and some of them recover and some of them die. But
it's the whole connection between the mind and the body. You know, we have that connection whereby if you put that thought in motion into the realm of the mind will, as I said, self-fulfilling prophecy. I think that the Western society in particular's view of death is that which has been Hollywood, or sort of Hollywoodized, for lack of a better word, sort of characterized, or it's bad marketing, or whatever you want to call it. It's not really as effective. It's not presented in the way that's useful to people's evolution, the way it is perhaps in Eastern philosophy, where we can see death is a celebration. Death is a time where we must get through in order to complete our cycle. I mean, the lotus opens and closes each day. A life begins and ends. When I talk about Pluto and the 12th house as a transformative quality with astrology, I often say, yeah, it's a transition. It's a transitory house. Things do happen, but the end of a pregnancy is an end, isn't it? And what happens at the end of a pregnancy? A baby's born. So it's a different way of twisting the end. The end is an ending. Yes, true. The end of a pregnancy is a birth. That's a wonderful new beginning. And in that little sample, that little example, we see the point we're trying to get at here.
I'd like to see more. I'm seeing more, especially since Pluto went through Scorpio, which was great but short-lived because Scorpio is its shortest sign. But I was seeing more discussion on right to die, and also on home funerals, and having a graceful death of your own choosing
Exactly.
Instead of dying hooked up to machines in a hospital or something like that.
Right. Pumped full of chemicals.
And what happens to your body, and green burial, and these questions. They began to really flourish in the Pluto and Scorpio period, and I want to see more. As a death shaman, I want to see more of that. I want to see us have a healthy relationship with how we treat our own deaths and the deaths of our loved ones, and not have them be about about suffering until the bitter end, and not have them and have some choice in that, and some spiritual choice in that. How do I want to make that transition in a way that is kind to my soul?
You want to shift the conversation, shift the context from one of fear and dread and fear,
And
dread, suffering, into one of a positive, successful transition, whereby we get from one stage to the next. It's always necessary. And you mentioned, when we look at these things called little deaths, the divorces, the loss of jobs, the loss of a friend, even the loss of a pet, which are very real. I would not minimize any of those things. They're very real. I lost a pet recently, and it still hurts. But these are necessary stages. That's just part of that is what the focus is on, why it's so important to live in the now, because it gives us a greater appreciation. We can't bury our heads in the sands always with regard to this topic. I think this is one of the major misconceptions of Western society. This is not the case in the East. They have a much different approach to the whole concept of death, and it is very much of a natural earthbound quality, that we're from ashes to ashes. This is as old as humankind, obviously. So.
Yeah, we isolate. We isolate people from dying people. And from the act of dying,
and the conversation becomes one of avoidance. Just the word, just the specter of that word in the conversation, people get all hush hush. Or if you meet somebody who's lost somebody, all of a sudden they become avoidable. No one wants to go near that person because they're afraid to talk to them. They're afraid they're going to fall apart. And I've experienced this in my own personal life, where I would go through a certain daily pattern, and people were friendly to me, and then the specter of death entered into my life in a very real manner, with something very close to me, and the relationships of those people to me after the fact were much different, because they thought of me as, oh, we don't want to bother him, he's grieving, or he's in trouble, or
they didn't know what to say.
They didn't know what to say, but what all I really wanted to do was to engage in the conversation. Let's talk about the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
And let's not avoid it. We don't want to run from this. This is not something that's worthwhile to run from.
Even if you don't know what to say, you can always listen.
Always listen, exactly.
Say, I don't know that I have anything to say about it, but why don't you talk? I'll listen, and just be there and be a listening presence, and that can be a great thing.
Right.
Important tip.
Important tip. Listen. Always listen. Don't write that down. It's important to listen, and doesn't require necessarily anything more than that. Just listen. You don't have to respond out of sympathy or cry or weep along with other people, although if you want to, you can. It's more about acknowledgement and acceptance of it as, like I said, the elephant in the room. People don't want to acknowledge that. It seems like it's a topic of avoidance, and that is concerning to me. Whenever I have found that when there's something that people want to avoid, it's all the more reason to jump into it and run into it. If there's something that is in your life that is unpleasant, rather than trying to avoid it, you sort of dash into it. You sort of go in headlong and charge after it and sort of take down that fear. And
something I've noticed with just pulling it back to the astrological 8th house is, if you want to know what is in someone's 8th house in terms of sign or planets, watch how they act around a funeral. Watch what they do when someone dies. And watch what their reaction is, and do they need to wait? Do they burst into tears? Are they no good for days, or something like that? You can often get a good guess as to how do they react to death. I think the 8th house, I think, is less about one's own death and more about one's reaction to death. Or
association with death in general as a topic.
Yeah. I've got Saturn there, actually, and so what I noticed.
So you're very dutiful when it comes to helping people.
I express mourning through work.
Yeah.
That's how I mourn. I'm the person who would bring the casseroles. I'm the one. I'm like, let me help with the funeral. I will go through your paperwork. I will help you with all those things. I will wash your dishes. I will plan. I will figure out how, if you are too out of it to manage figuring out we've got to have a reception and how can we feed 50 people. I will do that. And so my reaction to death is to get in there with the details and do the work. And I find at the end of doing that, and people who have maybe a Neptune there, or a moon there, or something like one of the more feeling planets there, they look at me and like, you must be blocking it out. No, that's how I mourn. So each person has their own way of mourning.
It's a mechanism. It's a coping mechanism.
Yeah.
It's interesting how different cultures deal with it, and they really are. There's quite a wide array. But I think the best examples that we can see, the most logical examples we see, go back to some of the oldest civilizations and how they coped with it, and we could learn from that. I think we sort of have strayed, especially when you look at the American industry of how they deal with death and sort of the business that's been built up around it and the guilt that's imbued on people and imposed rather, and that's sort of bothersome to me because it sort of misses the mark, and it sort of in many ways it's exploitive.
And children today grow up without having ever seen anyone die, even like the beloved relative dying at home, in bed or something like that. And
what better way to go?
And they grow up without seeing people care for bodies or work with bodies or handle them with respect, and all the steps along the way that would have been that our ancestors would have seen. They would have seen, and there would have been a way to do it, whether that was ritual, whether it was religious ritual, or whether it was just a cultural thing. This is how we do this. This is how we help people through this transition. Honor this transition with respect.
Yeah.
And we don't have that at
all.
But
it seems to be a modern problem, because when we look back to times when death was probably more prevalent or more likely in families, people used to have 10 kids because they knew that they were going to lose 4 or 5 of them. And it was just a necessary part of it. They bought them, kind of had children as insurance policies or whatever. That may not be the right word, but it was that sense of, the acceptance and the acknowledgement of that, because it probably was more prevalent, and as a result, because our modern medicines and our lifestyles have extended life to some extent, it sort of has taken away that inevitability, or sort of hidden the inevitability away somewhere. Where
people died at a much more rapid rate and much younger then, and so you would not make it to adulthood without seeing your relatives die.
Exactly.
It would happen.
Exactly. Yeah. So the shamanic approach to death becomes that of a celebration, would you say?
It becomes certainly acceptance, and it can be a celebration. Ideally, it should be acceptance of the cycle. It should be just like you would, maybe you're just the sort of person who's just disappointed when winter comes. Maybe in New England you're thinking 50 feet of snow. But still, there is beauty in winter, and saying, there is beauty in this. How can I find the beauty in this? And of course, there's always the question of, well, where am I going? And people ask me that, well, where am I going to go after I die? And the answer is, it depends. There's many answers to that depending on who you are and what's going on in your life, and there's 100 different ways that can happen. But to think of it as an adventure, to think of it as stepping forward into a new beginning, into a rebirth. And yes, it is hard to leave things behind that were undone. And it is hard to feel like, oh, I wanted more. But I really believe that you will get more. You will get more in some way, and more is on the road. You won't be able to see.
The show's not over.
Yeah, you may not know what's going on,
There's
but it's some
encore.
kind of more. It may not be the more you expected, but it's some kind of more.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. Also, it's important to we honor ancestors. There's not a shamanic tradition around that doesn't honor ancestors, and that's a matter of honoring those who came here and struggled and did whatever they had to do to survive so that we could be here. And whether that's ancestors of our bodies, with our DNA, or of our hearts, our beloved dead, or of our mind, ancestors of the mind who helped us, who put words out that inspire us, or ancestors of the spirit who put deeds out. You notice those line up with the directions, with the elements, earth, air, fire, water. And we honor these, and just, especially in my tradition. And if you don't like your relatives, you can always find other people, other beloved dead who really did something and mattered. And to know that by honoring them, you show yourself that you too matter. Of course, it also means you got to get off your ass and matter.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Well, what is the shamanic tradition? How does shamanic tradition address the topic of reincarnation? Do they believe in if there's another cycle that begins again at that point?
There is no one shamanic tradition. There are hundreds, and they vary.
Okay.
They vary. Some of them.
But is the concept of reincarnation part of it sometimes?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I mean, if you're talking about the difference between me doing Norse stuff, or a Mudang doing Korean stuff, or a Yanomamo Indian doing their stuff, or a Tibetan Bon shaman or something like that. We all have different ideas on that. In my tradition, there are places you go and don't reincarnate, and there are places that you can reincarnate. It depends on what is in store for you, and that's partly your choices, and partly the choices of the gods and the universe and the powers that be, and what is best for you. Mm-hmm. So, but there certainly is some people in my tradition believe that it happens largely down the family line. Some say that it could happen in any way. And also, because time isn't linear, we think it is, but once we leave this body in this particular world, time is not linear. You could be incarnating in a place that has nothing to do with your ancestry, but might be, for all you know, the ancestry of one of your descendants. Who knows who they're going to marry? Mm-hmm. So there is that, and there certainly is a certain amount of incarnating. I think there's a concept that some souls stay behind to watch. Some souls make that choice. And some of them, like we have the concept of Disir, which is sort of matriarchs. We don't have a useful corresponding male name that's only for that. But basically, your ancestors who said, I'm really invested in my family line. I'm going to stay here rather than going on, and I'm going to watch over my descendants. And that's going to be my thing. Or they might merge with land spirits. Some of them are so bound to the land. I've met land spirits who were very Native American and wanted Native American things, and then I've met a larger number of land spirits who were they weren't about any cultural thing. They were about snow and flowers and rocks, and I think that the ones that were very Native American here, it's because that was a human soul that merged with that spirit. So there's all sorts of places you can go, and some of it is popping into a body again. I am pretty sure that's what's going to go on with me, because I have done this repeatedly already.
Yeah, it's interesting, and many different cultures deal with the concept of reincarnation differently, and it does allow you to view death through that concept as well. Mm-hmm. We've been talking about the idea of death as a concept, but not so much as a negative concept by any stretch of the imagination, more as a necessary process of going down a pathway, coming to a fork in the road where you are at a juncture in time where you must take the next step. And I think it's wise to view it in the realm of a positive experience. How you cope with death can be seen perhaps in the astrology chart based on the construct of the chart and your ability to have certain characteristics and attributes that allow you to cope with it in different ways. I think it's important one thing I would say, if nothing else, would be that, if nothing else, it should force us to appreciate where we are now and let those know who we love that we are there for them now. Embrace the now, because the now is really all we have. Yep. And to think of anything else is foolish. We've been talking today. My guest has been Raven Caldera, and if you need information about this topic, or you are interested in having your astrology chart done, which is greatly a compendium of information about you as an individual, you can visit my website, turningatthewheel.com. And your website, Raven?
If you would like your chart done by me in shamanic format, that's ravencaldera.org. And look at the links on the side.
Very good. Well, it's been great talking to you. I know this is a difficult topic for some people, but I think the more we talk about it, the more we get the elephant into the room and we recognize that elephant, the greater we can expand and be ready for when those times come. And it's by no means discounting the specter of death in anyone's life or anybody who's gone through a difficult time. It is more about just acceptance of the here and now. So thank you very much for coming in and talking about this. It's always great to expand ourselves and talk about these great topics. Thank you.